Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about polling. And the first thing is, I've already mentioned this, and I sent an email. So does everyone have the iClicker polling tool open, logged into it? Okay, so I'm just going to show basically, I thought the best way to do this was for you to see what it would be like from a student perspective when faced with these questions. I'm going to start a poll. You should see this thing on the screen. This is basically the icon that you use to do the polling. You just log into it as an instructor the same way. You can put it wherever you want out of the way. And when you're ready to do a poll, you would just click on it. You would choose poll, and then you choose the type of question. So I'm asking for concerns about the spring semester, and I'm going to let that be a short answer response, but I'm also going to set it to be anonymous. So that way, if you want to do a poll at the beginning of class, asking students how they're doing, asking them to check in, ask them about any concerns they have, or ask them about something in the news or whatever you'd like. If you just like to get a read on students, you can open it this way. And now I've chosen the type of response, and now I just click the play button to actually start collecting the responses. And it's asking me what screen I want to use, and that popped up on my other screen, and there we go. So now, if you're in the app, you'll have a window that will allow you to respond there. Most students tend to do this with their smartphone, but if they happen to have a laptop in class or a Chromebook or any web-connected device, they can do it right in there. And you don't have to put in your real responses, but it's anonymous, so type whatever you'd like there. So preparing for this spring semester, our fifth semester of pandemic teaching, what might be some concerns about what's going to happen this semester?
John, I'm being really slow here. What do I've opened up, what do I need to click on in this? I've opened up it in the browser. Why do I need to click on to actually answer?
Yeah, me too.
You should just be able to type in that window.
Not letting
There
me.
should be. Are you seeing the question?
Yes.
Okay. If you click, there should be a box below it where you could respond. We have someone who submitted an anonymous response, so asking who it was. Well, okay. Where did you?
I can't click on it. It's funny.
I think I just scrolled down and there was a little man with a hat and glasses, and it's like anonymous response below.
Okay, so it's
Oh,
probably
I
right
see
there.
it. I see it. Yep.
It's probably more obvious on a mobile device because there's a box that pops up there. And the anonymous, the glasses and hat signals that it's anonymous, so they know the instructor wouldn't be able to match their responses to them.
So I'm the only person who can't figure this out. So I'm your slow student here.
This is
Do you
always-
want to share your screen and maybe we can figure it out, or I could stop my share.
I'll share my screen.
Because this would be good to have in the recording too, just so.
Oops. Did you?
We saw
Now I don't
just
see your slides at all.
right, they're not being displayed because your share screen should be. So if you share the screen, choose, do you have multiple windows?
Yep.
Choose the one with the browser on it. There we go. Okay, so now if you click on the tab where the question shows up. Oh, are you logged in? Click on that to join it, maybe. There we go. Nothing to see there.
No, it'll get you there eventually. I was in the same spot.
Okay,
Join
so
class,
yeah,
yep.
right. And so this is something where at the start, the first time I use this, or the first few times, I'll tell students to join the class. I start it right before the class begins, then they join, and there's the box.
Yeah.
And you will always allow extra time at first, and you answer any questions, and you wander around and help students and so forth. And generally, students will help each other. Okay. So that I should have said that. That was my mistake. I'm used to doing that in class, but I didn't think of it here. And where did my slides go? Where did my slides go? There we go. Okay. So the first thing I should have done, well, I said join iClickerCloud as a student, but the next step is to actually start the class. Okay. So this turns out to be really easy. You notice how easy it was for me to do. All I had to do was open the program and click on the poll button to start it. We've got 3 responses and there's 3 people here. So the next step is I'm going to stop these from coming in. And now if I'd have the option of either, if I had a second window, I could look at the results there and then decide whether to share them. But I'm just going to share the results right here on the screen, which often I would do in class. So I'd ask students if they have any concerns, if they had any problems in class, and then I'll often just call it right up and see what people were saying. And sometimes respond to them and so forth. Now, if you have a lot of responses, and I had one of my smallest large classes, but I still had 189 students at the start of the semester, and I think 186 at the end. One option you could do is if you're getting responses like asking students concerns, you could do a word cloud and you could see what words were coming up most often, which is a good way of, if you ask some students to describe 2 or 3 words describing their feelings or their reactions to something, or it could be to a reading. If you've got a lot of students, you could scroll through it and address some of those, or you could just call up the word cloud and see what words were most common. And not surprisingly, perhaps COVID was a common word in there and so forth. And then you could go back to the individual issues. Okay, so that's one type of question you could use. And it's a good way of getting feedback. And it might be, you could make it either anonymous or not. So I'm going to turn anonymous off for the next stage. Well, I guess I'll leave it on for all of it. But if it was not anonymous, then it's something you could add to the gradebook. Anonymous things you couldn't in general. You could also ask students to report their confidence on something. So you could ask them a question and get their perceptions of how strongly they feel about it or how confident they are about that, just to see whether students are accurately measuring, their level of understanding to help them develop metacognition. And you can do that on any of the question types, I believe, which that's actually a new feature. That wasn't there last fall. They've been adding to this. So I'm going to turn off the results again. And let's go to some reasons why we might use polling. And I'm going to, again, try a poll on this. And let's see, does this allow me to do multiple responses? I think you can do multiple responses with this. So I'm going to capture the desktop here, and that shows up on that other screen. So if they're just using a mobile device, they can see the question as well as the response. So what might be some ways where polling might be useful in a class? Why might you do it? And you can see that there's 3 responses now. If you want to put more in, you're welcome to. If it's a multiple choice or numeric question, they can answer it as many times as they want, but only the last time is graded if you assign correct answers. Well, let's see what the responses are. You could see if folks are paying attention. That's certainly true that, they have to pay attention to at least answer the questions. How well students understand key concepts and after the peers present on them, that's a really good way of doing it. And also to assess their learning comprehension and assessing what they know and it's often used just to see what people come into class with, what their preconceptions are, what their biases are, and so forth. And then you could have a presentation or discussion, and then see how that's changed, for example. So let me talk about the question types. One of these is real-time polling may be used to. I'm going to put up a multiple choice question this time. And we already addressed some of these, but with multiple select, students can select more than one answer. And here, I'm going to leave that. Oops, I didn't stop the last one, sorry. So now I'm going to change this to multiple choice, and we're going to start the polling. And oh, but it's not multiple choice. I was getting a phone call on my watch, so I got distracted. So multiple answers. So this is a type of question where there may be more than one answer that students could have, which could be asking for their opinions, or it could be testing their understanding of some concept. So now there's a question there. We got 1 response, 2, and 3. And in this case, we'll look at the results, and this is correct. Well, I got to stop the polling. And in fact, each one of these could work. I guess I can't, if this was not anonymous, I would be able to select them as being correct. Because it's anonymous, it's not graded, so it doesn't give you that option. What would happen is if this was in a regular class and people were being graded on the question, when I click on it, it would turn it green, indicating that it's a correct response. And then I would do it for each of those, because each of those, in fact, worked. That students have some perception of their understanding of concepts, but when you ask them questions and they answer it, if the questions are ones that are either something that they get wrong, either they get it wrong or they don't, it's giving them some feedback, letting them know that, yes, you do understand this and, you know, you're ready to move on, or there are some issues with this and you don't quite get it. So it helps students get immediate feedback on what they understand and what they don't understand. And it also, that second point, it gives us that real-time feedback of what students understand and what they don't. And you get to hear from everybody in the class, not just those people who are anxiously waving their hands or, you know, blurting something out, but you're hearing from everyone, including those quiet people who are hiding in the back of the room or hiding in the front of the room. And as mentioned before, it helps bring students back to focus that, you know, we all get distracted if we're in a long, you know, in any type of long activity. This brings students right back to focus. And what will happen is quite often there'll be a discussion stage where students are discussing this with each other. And all of a sudden it gets really noisy in the class, but then it will get much quieter when you're ready to go over it. And again, we can use it to see what students come in thinking is correct, and we can use that to address any misconceptions or preconceptions that they have that may be inconsistent with where we're hoping them to go, and also those check-ins. So those are all really useful types of activities. And people who were at the last session will have an advantage on this, but this is just another little question asking what sort of learning gains people found in terms of the use of clickers. Pick anything, it doesn't matter so much. We've got 2 responses, we got all 3, so I'll stop it. Now in class, by the way, you can set this for a countdown, and I use a countdown because in a class of 180, there's always going to be some people who are going to hold off until the last second. And if you don't give them a timer where the numbers get bigger in the last 10 seconds, they're going to hold off and try to stall a little bit. So the countdown is what I tend to use for multiple choice questions. For free response, I'll leave it open longer and do a count up. But then I'll tell them I'm going to cut this off in a certain amount. And so let's see how people voted. And we had C and D. And in fact, the answer is D, that Eric Mazur found learning gains of 300%. And compared to a class which did not use clickers. And Carl Wyman, in a study with several other chemists, found learning gains of a little over 200%. So learning in chemistry and physics classes on specific concepts where they gave students a pretest and then a post-test, where in some cases they use in some class sections, they use traditional lectures. And in the other case, they use active learning in a flipped class environment using clickers. The learning gains were between 2 and 3 times as much in terms of the difference between the pre-test and the post-test scores after the treatment was applied. So and pretty much anyone who's used clickers in classes, particularly in STEM disciplines, have found learning gains. But virtually all classes find some significant improvements in student learning. At the very least, there's an increase in student perceptions of enjoyment of the class. Students tend to enjoy using clickers. It becomes a little bit more game-like. They like to try these things and see how they do. If they, as long as they're getting enough of them correct to feel good about it. What most people who use clickers do, by the way, is they give students some points for just any answer and then other points for a correct answer. In my classes, for example, I'll give students 3 points for any answer and 5 points if the answer is correct. So even if they get everything wrong, they still get at least a 60% on that grade. So, and you tend to try, in practice, you try to choose questions that are relatively challenging, that will stretch students a little bit where the answer is not obvious. And by doing that, if they get half of them right, they'd end up with an 80% on it. If they do better than that, their score would be higher. And the other thing that most people who use clickers do is they tend to drop a lot of these. In my large class, which meets twice a week, I drop at least typically 5 class days. I dropped, I think, 6 this last time, simply because there were so many students in and out with COVID or with other issues. But so, if they could be absent 5 or 6 times, or, if they happen to do less well on some days, or they forgot their phone or something similar, dropping 5 or 6 of them makes it a whole lot easier to not worry about it. So if they make some mistakes, it's pretty low cost, and most of them were averaging probably like 85 to 87 or so % on their clicker scores, unless they just happen not to show up at all during the semester. And what happened, though, is even when students were remote because they had COVID, or they were in quarantine because their roommate did or something similar, they could still participate from wherever they were because the poll was active and you could use it from anywhere. And I did use Zoom for my classes so that students could participate even as long as they weren't in a hospital when locked down where they couldn't use their computers. So that works pretty well. And let's see.
John, can I ask a quick question?
Sure, I'm sorry.
Is there a point of diminishing returns for those who use polls without really assigning credit for them?
Probably. And probably assigning some credit is useful. It could be just attendance. One thing, you have the option of just assigning participation points, where they get a certain number of points if they just participate in the poll, which becomes sort of like attendance, but it's because of their participation. And, I know Kevin White was using clickers for several years in his Native American class, and he only did it based on participation, that as long as they answered, and you can set up the participation criteria saying either you get full credit if you answer all the questions, or if you participate in all the questions, or if you miss at most 1 or 2, or if you participate in over half of them. You can set different criteria to give you participation points. So that's a nice, easy way of doing it without worrying about whether there's correct answers. If you only want to get opinions or reactions, you could just give students credit for responding. But I suspect if you ask too many questions, that would probably have some diminishing returns there.
Do you demo setting up the points and all the grading stuff? Because that's the part that just will put me right off if I don't know how to do
that's
that.
actually,
Okay.
that's the next session to
Great.
talk about doing it. And once it's set up, it's there for the semester. So
Thank you.
welcome. And any other questions on this? Okay, well, then the next type of question is a numeric question. So here, suppose there are 100 student COVID cases next week. If the new weekly caseload rises by 10% per week, how many new cases would be expected 2 weeks later? This is still anonymous, so don't worry if you get it wrong. But I'm going to start the poll, and now it's going to ask for a number. And this is what's used often in chemistry classes and, well, in STEM fields in general, where students have to do some computations and respond with a numeric response. And numeric responses, you generally give students more time because it does require more than just a multiple choice type thing. We got 3 responses, so I'll stop the polling and see the results. And in fact, it would be 121 because it would grow by 10% the first week to 110. And then 10% more than that would be 1.1 squared times the original. So it would be 121. And if this was not anonymous, I could click on this, it would turn green, and that would give students the extra points they get for answering it correctly. And in fact, the number of new cases would be 11. Well, because it's rising by 10%, it would rise from 100 to 110. So those 110 would be new cases given them, but it would be 11 above the initial new cases. I'm hoping that doesn't happen. Now, this one, don't worry about what the answer is, but this is one I actually used in my class where students went over this diagram where they were measuring consumer surplus, producer surplus, the impact of taxes and so forth. All you have to do though here, I'm going to choose this as a target response. I want to just demonstrate each of these questions. I'll start the polling and just click on, now you could also do this by the way with multiple choice with the letters, but just click anywhere on that image, either with the mouse or on your screen, and it will select an answer. So you could click on E, A, D, B, C, or F, any of those areas, or somewhere else entirely if you want. I will say the correct answer turns out to be A. So if you want to click on that box there, you can. And so this could be used if you have an image, if you have a piece of artwork, if you have a map, if you have, I don't know. And we have 3 responses. So I will click on this and then I'll look at the results, and everyone, actually, it looks like that's a little bit below that. But now what you do to select the correct answer, and I can't do this because it's anonymous. Okay, what I would be able to do basically is define a rectangle around the correct answer, and that would flag those as being correct. But you can also see where people are choosing the answers if that would be relevant and so forth. Actually, let's try this one again, and it should be right in box A. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to change the question so it's not anonymous. So I'm going to turn that off just so you could see what it looks like when you get a target response so.
And you still vote for the wrong answer?
Well, you could pick a correct or an incorrect answer, either way. You're not being graded on this, so. Okay, so we've got 3 responses, and now when I click on results, I see this box, and what I can do here is choose a rectangle, and well, I can make 2 areas here. I made it a little small, but you can always go back and revise it. But so there were 0 correct, 3 incorrect because everyone picked the lower region as, you know. But so what that would do though is you generally would choose the rectangle more generously and a bit more carefully. I'm working on a pretty small 13-inch screen here. It works better on a bigger screen too. And then you just choose whatever the area is where the correct responses are. It is a rectangle, which will limit the use a little bit, but you could always make it a bit bigger so it includes whatever area it's supposed to be. And Now, if this was connected to a grade book, it's not, that those scores would be uploaded with whatever the incorrect response score would be. Okay. And I've only experimented with this. Most of the time I've used numeric or multiple choice or free response questions. And so those are the basic responses. Now, up until this year, we use physical clickers. You can still use those. That in general, this system works with the physical clickers. If students happen to have them, they could use them, but there are some restrictions. One is students, if they don't have clickers, would have to buy them. And the physical clickers is more expensive than the mobile app, in particular, because a mobile app is free right now. But even if that's not free, they'd have to, well, even if they had to pay for the mobile app is still cheaper, especially if they're going to be using it for some time. And they could only use multiple choice, and you lose the multiple select, the free response, the numeric response, and the target if students are just using the clickers. So the mobile app works a bit better. The only people who might want to use the physical clickers are people who feel really strongly that we should not let students have any technology made in the last century in the classroom. So if you don't want to allow students to have their smartphones or computer, then if you wanted to do polling, you'd either have to do something different. It could be holding up signs or raising their hands, or something similar. Or it could be, you could use the physical clickers where students vote with that, and then they're not being able to be distracted with their smartphones or laptops or whatever. And the other difference between what we have now and what we used to have is you log in on the web to run this. It's installed on all the desktop computers on campus. So you just sign in as an instructor to be able to access your courses. And it is integrated, or you can set up very easily integration with a Blackboard gradebook. You do that once, and from then on, the grades are just automatically ported over to it. The physical clickers look something like this. They're roughly $20 used on Amazon or elsewhere or in the bookstore. They're about $45 new. It's a one-time purchase. That compares to, again, the mobile app, which is currently free, or in the worst case, it's $50 if students want to use it for 4 years. And unlike some other systems where you pay by the class, once you either have the physical clicker or you have that account, you could use it in any number of classes. So yeah, short answers would not be an option, nor numeric answers would not be, nor the target responses. It's basically just a simple multiple choice type test of understanding. And the physical clickers also require that students be in the classroom, while with the mobile app, in principle, they could be anywhere, but there is an option of turning geolocation on so that students would have to be within a certain distance of your computer. I've never done that. I've only used this again last semester because we only had access to it last semester. But my concern was that there was always going to be students out last semester because of COVID or because of other illnesses or because of family members or funerals or other things. So I wanted to allow them to connect from wherever they happen to be. So, but you could narrow it down so they'd have to, at the very least, be within some distance of the classroom. And again, the advantage of that is you don't have distractions, but you lose a lot of features and it can be more costly. So right now it's free this spring. If students do have to pay, it's, and I should also note, it costs $4 per student to the college, per student per semester. If students have to pay, they'd have to pay $15.99. $24.99 for a year's use, or $34.99 for 2 years. And if someone comes in as a transfer, they might want to get the 2-year subscription. If they want to use it, if they're a freshman and they might be using it again, it's $49.99. We adopted iClicker as a standard so that students didn't have to pay for multiple devices. And use fell off at the start of the pandemic because we didn't have a way of doing this remotely, but with iClicker Cloud, we can. So as of the fall, we've got back that ability. We used to have probably about 24, 25 classes that use iClicker. Nearly all instructors in the economics department use it in at least one of the classes, and several people use it in all of their classes. So, and it's also being used a moderate amount in chemistry, biology, and some physics classes. So if students get the app and they use it, it's likely they can use it in more than one class, and it's likely they might be using it more over time. And it's most cost effective the more students use this, so that once students have the clicker or they have the mobile app, you know, it costs the same to the institution or to them to use it in 5 classes as it does to use it in 1 class. And the more people who adopt this, the better off we are in terms of using it efficiently. So unlike other things where the more we use something, it costs more, the more we use this, the less costly it is. So, and back before we went remote, before the pandemic, in my large class where I typically have 300 to 400 students, usually at least half to 60% of them were using clickers in at least one other freshman level class. And once they had it, they could use it in other classes as well. So while I hated to make students pay for a device, I felt better knowing that they were going to be using it over and over again. So it was a one-time purchase. Okay. If you don't want to allow mobile devices, there has to be a base station in the classroom, a receiver to receive the signals from those little devices. That just plugs into the computer, and it will work in the same way, except again, you only have multiple choice option. But if you want to do any of those other things, you have to use the mobile version, the iClicker Cloud. And again, students can attend remotely from either device if they have the mobile app, but you can't use a physical clicker unless you're within a couple hundred yards of the receiver, and you can't even use them typically outside of the room where the receiver is located. And again, I mentioned the geofencing. Now, the best practice, this has been based on some research done by Eric Mazur, Derek Ruff, and several other people who've looked at this, particularly in the STEM fields, is to ask students a question. Generally, this is multiple choice and numeric question typically, because this was developed in the STEM disciplines. Ask them to respond individually without discussing it. And for those of you who may have attended Eric Mazur's demonstration a few years back, that's what he did. He asked, the example he gave when he was here is he said, suppose you have a metal plate with a hole in it and you heat it up in the oven. What happens to the size of that hole as you heat the plate? Will it get bigger or will it get smaller? And he asked everyone to do it, and everyone wanted to start talking about it. He said, now be quiet, just do this first individually. And then he got the results and he didn't display them. And so that's what would happen. He'd look at the response, and that's what most instructors who do this would do, is they'd look at how people are responding. And if you see that somewhere between 30 and 80 or 85% of people have the correct response, then that's a question where there's lots of good learning opportunities. If you only get 10% of the people answering it correctly, peer discussion isn't going to help much because no one really understands enough to be able to progress. If you've got 95% of the class understanding it, there's probably not going to be a lot of gain from having people discuss it. But if his suggestion, and when I've tried to reach, I usually get a little bit higher than this, is to try to find questions about half the class will get it wrong. And then, so if you can get about half the class getting it right and about half the class getting it wrong, you then ask students to discuss it. And what I normally tell students is to find people around them with a different answer and then to debate it. Listen to their arguments about why they picked the other answer, and then make your best case for why you pick your answer. And generally, depending on the complexity of the question, this might be anywhere from 2 minutes up to 5 or 6 minutes. And then I would often wander around the room pre-COVID and talk to them. If I had undergraduate TAs, they'd wander around and talk to students as well. And then you ask students to vote again. And what will always happen nearly always happen is the correct answer will go up. If it started at 50%, it might be at 60% or 70% after they've had a chance to discuss it. And the more obviously incorrect answers that sometimes might get 10 or 12% will often go down close to zero, because students who have answers that are really obviously wrong, when they listen to other people explain it, generally they'll move away from that. But if there's some answers that are close, you generally won't converge to 100%, but there'll be some convergence, and you'll see that progress. And it feels really good to see that having that peer discussion results in some gains, at least 99.9% of the time in my experience. And I've been using these for about 12 years in one way or another. And then when everyone votes the second time, you'll ask students why they chose responses, or depending on the time and the pressure, how things are moving, you might just address it. Now, most people chose this. Does anyone see any problems with this argument, or why did you select this? So you can ask students to explain their choices, and then you reveal what the correct answer is after people have had a chance to explain why they selected the things they did. And often you could provide some feedback and say, well, have you considered this effect? One example that I've always used, that it's an example in economics, where we ask students where I ask students something like the following. Suppose that our goal is to raise the well-being of individuals as they perceive it themselves. Which would be a more effective strategy by the government? Providing everyone with a $500, or providing low-income households with $500 a month in cash benefits, or providing $500 a month in housing and food vouchers? And what will almost always happen is, in the first round of this, students will suggest that people will feel better off if we give housing and food vouchers. And I'll show those results, and this is what happens. And then I'll ask a different question. And the question I'll ask is, suppose it's your birthday or some other holiday where you get gifts. Which would you rather get from your grandparents? Would you rather get a $500 in cash, or would you rather get a $500 gift charge to Amazon? Would you rather get $500 worth of clothing that your grandparents select for you, or $500 gift card to Amazon? And all of a sudden the answer suddenly switches. And then, we'll discuss that a bit. And it's a really productive discussion, because, they have very strong views of what should happen in terms of how people spend their money, but it becomes a little bit different when it's their own choices involved. And that's a really effective learning experience at this stage in looking at paternalism and other views there. But that discussion is where much of the learning occurs. Much of the peer discussion will often work, but on that one question, it very rarely switches from the answer of the housing and food vouchers to, the cash transfers. And then we talk about that a bit and say, well, what if, someone is poor and needs better health care? Or what if they're living with relatives and they have adequate food and housing, but they have these other needs, or they really would prefer to get more educational benefits or something similar. Perhaps people are better able to judge what's in their own interest than perhaps society as a whole might be able to do that. But it's a good, productive discussion that is, once students commit to a decision, they want to know what the correct answer is. And by the way, did anyone attend Eric Missouri's session way back? It was like 7 or 8 years ago. Okay. Do you remember what he did with this, Gwen, after the second time with the discussion?
I don't, I confess.
Okay. Well, what he did, and this really stood out to me because I was already using clickers, is he said, now look at what happened here. If I was to ask you, what would happen to the size of a hole in a plate if I was to give you a lecture on what happens to the size of a hole in a a plate of metal when it's heated in the oven, that would be about the most boring lecture you could possibly you could possibly imagine. And yet here you are actively arguing about it, debating this, and now you all want to know the answer. And that's why clicker use is such an effective active learning technique. And then he went on to his next slide, and people were angry because he didn't reveal the answer. And he did that intentionally. And he does that whenever he gives that talk, because what happens is it shows that it provokes your curiosity. You've committed to a position, and now you want to know whether you were right or not, which is something that doesn't naturally occur if you're just sitting there listening to someone else do it. And that was perhaps one of the most effective strategies that he used there, just to sell the benefits of these discussions, that peer discussion, and the intrinsic curiosity that it provokes when students have committed to something and they want to know what the answer is. It makes it much more memorable. So,
What was the answer?
Oh, so the answer, okay, there we go. That was unintentional, but it gets bigger. And he gave 3 different explanations of why it did. He said, suppose instead of cutting a hole, you just used a marker to mark that circle on that plate, and you put it in the oven. As the whole metal plate expands, the hole would expand. And then he gave some other, issues in terms of molecular motion and so forth, about the increase in energy pushes things further apart, which would make the hole bigger as the whole thing expands. But so he provided multiple ways of explaining it, but yeah, so it does get bigger. But it was not something that was intuitively obvious. And that's the type of question that in STEM disciplines in particular that tend to be most effective, where if you understand the basics, it's not necessarily clear what's going to happen in that specific application. And those are the types of questions that really help to deepen your understanding in those areas. So, so that's all I had for this presentation, but does anyone have any questions?
Yes, I think Maureen was after it too. So how do you how do you set this up?
Okay, so I will stop this. And by the way, when you stop it, oops, let me go back again. When you stop this, you just go back to here and you end the session. So I'll end the class, but you notice, by the way, it ends with gives you the option of an exit poll. So if you want to do an exit ticket, you can do it right then and ask students to respond, which they don't have to do immediately. They could go back in after class, or you could just do it right before the end and have them respond right then. But I'm actually going to end it. So what would happen is, I'm going to close that, but what would happen basically is in the classroom on the podium, there would be a shortcut to iClicker Cloud. And then you would log into it. Because this is on my computer, it's already logged in, but you would log in with your username and your password for iClicker Cloud, and you would have, for any class that you've set up, and you set this up in advance, you would just click on that specific class and just click Start Class. And once you start the class, it will pop up that little icon, and that's what you use. And when basically, you just choose poll. You could also check the roster, or you could do a quiz. The quizzes is primarily used for asynchronous, but you could do it in class, where a quiz is just a whole series of questions that students are faced with in order. Most people tend not to use it for this because we've got Blackboard, or later we'll have Desire to Learn for quizzes outside, which will be much more flexible than this. But if you wanted to, you could do an in-class quiz where you start the class with 5 or 6 or 10 questions, and they all come in at once. And then you'd get the responses that way. And that would be set up as self-graded. But typically you would just, once you're ready for a poll, any questions that you have, you'd put on PowerPoint, or you'd type on Notepad, or you put on Word. When Kevin used to use the same sort of structure in his classes, he'd just open up Notepad on the computer and type a question and ask students to respond to it with their views and so forth. So it could be done in real time. Anything that's displayed on the screen is captured in that on that screen. You remember when I clicked on Show Results, it showed the answers and the questions. And what it did basically was it did a screen grab of what's on the screen. So anything that you use to put the question on, if students can see it on the screen, it will show up in the app. And when you go to grade it or to look at the grades, it will show you each of the questions and how people voted. And if you selected answers as correct, you would then see that as being, you'd see the number of points they got from that question. Maureen.
I'm afraid I'm now totally lost. I thought that the questions got inputted into the iClicker, but you're talking about them doing it elsewhere. I'm so lost.
Well, the questions are actually, iClicker does not require you to input the questions. You just put them in your slides, Google Slides, PowerPoint, whatever you're using. So you put the questions in there, and then you use this just to collect responses. Okay.
That means I have to have multiple things open, and that's already a risky proposition when I'm teaching online.
Well, it's not really that bad, because once you open this just floats on top of whatever you have open. So if you're going to use slides, you just put the questions in there. It's agnostic to what platform you're using. And that's where the power of this is. You could use other polling software. The problem for me with Zoom is you have to enter all the questions in advance, choose a poll, and then you can't really easily get the results of that back out. With this, all you do is you put the questions right on the slide, whatever type you want. And then when you get to that slide, you just click on this, choose a poll, choose the type of question. Most of the time I use multiple choice, but you could choose, or if you're doing a number of free response things, you could just use short answer, and it will stay that way until you're ready. So let's say you want to do a short answer question, and then you just click on the green button to get the question polling. It's asking me now, and you can see this, what screen I want to display. And that's because I have multiple screens up. If you only are using your own laptop and you don't have a separate screen on the side, Go Bigger is the name of the cheap little LED screen I've got on the side. And then I could choose specific windows if I wanted, but usually I just put it right on the desktop. And now it's capturing this image, which would not be very helpful because there's no text there. But if students are in class and they hear me saying it, they could then respond. In fact, if you open the app now, you'd see the screen as the image, and you could respond to it and type in something, and that would show up as a response. So if you want to, you could just do it verbally and ask students to type in something. But it's probably a little bit easier when they see the actual question right there. But that shows up only from whatever is displayed on the screen. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but now I have a follow-up question, and that is, you sort of mentioned that this is easily ported, and that presumes that the students have already been logged in. Like they kind of have to populate this themselves. You don't populate it.
Actually,
it's only through registering that they do it. Okay, so
no,
again,
for this session, yes. But if you're using it with a class, it's connected to Blackboard. And
that's what I need to see.
And in Blackboard, what will happen is it will load when you set it up, it will load your roster. And the roster will automatically populate everyone. And then when students connect to it after you populated it, once they sign into this with their SUNY Oswego email address, they get the account for free. And it will show them every class where this is used, and they just select that course. So they don't have to do anything more because they're already automatically added to the class. They just have to download the class and sign up. I think when they sign up, it will ask them which class, what campus they're on, and then it will ask them, I'm not sure if it even does that anymore. It used to ask them what their campus was. They'd select SUNY Oswego. Then it would ask them for the instructor. There'd be a list of instructors that were using it, and then they'd select the course. But I believe that's all automated now for students.
So can you show us what this looks like in Blackboard?
The problem is I can, but I probably should stop the recording because the only cases where I have it in Blackboard is for my class from the fall. So I'm going to stop recording here. It's behind this. And it's still hiding. That was a problem where I had things covering my screen. So